And welcome back, fourth and long fans. It's your footy correspondent, Coach Donnie Hess here, back with another chat on the Donnie's disposals. And ladies and gentlemen, this gentleman that is joining me made a very interesting evening for me with he broke some news. We'll talk about that later, but I want to sit here and chat with this gentleman, Mr. David Cherny. Daniel, how are you doing, sir?
That's all right, Donnie. You going well yourself?
I am not doing too bad. It is a pleasure to sit down and talk with you, sir, and find out a little bit about your run in footy. But I always start my podcast kind of wanting to know a little bit about the person. I mean, I know we all love talking footy, we all love chatting footy, but I like kind of knowing a little bit about the person outside of the game of footy. So just a little bit about yourself outside of the game of Aussie rules.
Sure. Well, I am 31 years old, but was born in Melbourne, so I've lived here my entire life, which I think has been a good thing overall. I studied a law degree, very poorly, I might add, but did finish it eventually, but never really had the passion for that. And that's how I sort of veered off into journalism and sports journalism, but we can discuss that more later. But I studied that here in Melbourne at Monash University, and I'm recently married and have a cat named Louis, Tabby, and live just in St Kilda, so not too far from the city here, and then the MCG. So it'll be for your viewers in the States and elsewhere. For context, that's a sort of a 15 to 20-minute drive from the MCG, and not far from probably 10 to 15 minutes from Moorabbin, where the Saints train and are based, and even closer to Junction Oval, where they were years and years ago. So yeah, Melbourne born and bred. Love Melbourne. Hard to imagine living anywhere else, so embedded in the culture here, and clearly footy and sport are huge parts of that culture.
Awesome. So again, being a Melbourne-born player, footy is part of your life. So let's get into it. What's your favorite part about the sport of Aussie rules football?
I think the thing that really at its heart that I love is the way in which it captures huge swathes of the population here in Melbourne. I think it's such a great discussion point. It feels like, and it's not everyone, but a huge percentage of the population here. It's a great icebreaker in conversation. You can talk about the footy with most people. I love how it sort of unites people. How it's the tribalism of it, the storylines of famous old clubs and their ebbs and flows historically, and just how it's just culturally so rich and such a big part of I say Australian life, but I think and maybe some interstate or non-Victorians mightn't like hearing this, but just the way particular, and I clearly get the how big it is interstate, but I think when you grow up in Melbourne, that the fact that you have 10 Victorian clubs and it's such a big part of Victorian life, and it is sort of people compare it to a religion. I think it's not. There are clearly some similarities. So just the way it's embedded into Victorian and Melbourne life is what really draws me to it. I mean, there's obviously so many facets of it. The skilled athleticism, the storylines, the compelling nature of matches, the twists and turns. I think there's the context of it. I think sport needs context, and I think Aussie rules is rich in context. So because it's been going on, because the league itself is 125 years old. So there's a lot to like about it, and there's some things I like.
Now there's so many to pick. It's hard to narrow it down sometimes. So I want to go back and I want to go back in time just a little bit. You have so much more the growth into it. I mean, again, we kind of explained to it off mic because I kind of got into it a little bit earlier than most over here. But for you, you're almost born into it. So can you remember your earliest footballing memory?
Yeah, I sort of my memories come from when I was about uh, 5 in 1996. I sort of remember the 96 season is the best one I remember, and I remember it reasonably well, which is quite, I suppose, remarkable because I don't remember that much else from that age. But that probably says a bit about what you remember. I grew up I was born into in a St Kilda supporting family through my dad, primarily my dad. So I was a St Kilda supporter growing up, and I still am. And was probably the passion wanes a bit when you work in it, but certainly was very passionate growing up, and probably through into my early 20s. But my earliest memory is I vaguely recall St Kilda winning what was the pre-season premiership in 1996, which was quite a big upset. They beat Carlton Waverley. I wasn't there, but I just sort of remember it being a big deal at the time. And then a few weeks later, I attended my first game. My dad took me to what was then known as Optus Oval, the Carlton ground. For some reason, St Kilda were playing Melbourne there at Princes Park, and as I walked into the ground, they're actually, and it's topical because he was just inducted to the Hall of Fame last week, but Nicky Win, for some reason we got there late, and Nicky Winmar had injured himself, and he was being put into an ambulance because he'd hurt his knee quite badly, or leg or knee, and it was sort of this vague recollection of seeing him on a stretcher, or being wheeled into an ambulance, into the bowels of, or outside or in the bowels of the ground. But yeah, those are my earliest memories, but a lot of memories of the 96 season, which was quite, I think it's hard to know, but that was the centenary season of the VFL AFL, and 100th season, and it was there were a lot of big deal made of that. There was documentaries and books commissioned, and a lot of special events. There was a reenactment round. They reenacted the first ever round from 1897, which is actually only 99 years, but they did it for, and it was a huge year. And the Fitzroy merger, there was talk of the Melbourne and Hawthorn merging at that time. There were a lot of big events. That was the Hall of Fame came in, so there was a lot of, I suppose there was a lot of focus on a lot of seminal events and a lot of historic reflection. So I wonder whether that, I hadn't thought about this much, but I suppose when your introduction to the sport comes at a time when there's a lot of looking back, that probably gives you a pathway into reflect. That's probably a reason why I'm more likely to sort of be appreciative of the game's history, because it was a period in which there was probably disproportionate focus on the game's history.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. That's great. And just the crazy part about that is still thinking about how old the sport really is and how old the VFL AFL actually is, just history. So I got to ask this. I mean, growing up in Melbourne, did you play footy? And if so, what position did you play?
I actually didn't play. Footy. I was. It was sort of a bit of a regret. I actually played more soccer and cricket,
Mm-hmm.
And some tennis and some other things. So I think my parents were a bit reluctant for me to play, for various reasons. So I didn't play. I sort of, yeah, I'm not deeply regret it, because I sort of enjoyed playing the other sports that I played, but I always had the passion for footy. But no, I didn't. Although I am actually umpiring a bit at the moment, for what it's worth. I've been doing a bit of umpiring through the VAFA, the Amateur Association, through my sort of local club, in which I've got a few friends and who are aligned with Ajax, who's the Jewish, so the club aligned to the Jewish community here. So I suppose that's the closest I've come to playing. So I've done that over the last couple of years, which has been a bit of fun. Pretty low level, definitely low level of umpiring, and probably low level of footy too. So it's that's been some good fun.
Awesome. So you said you didn't ever regret it because you played all the other sports, but if you had that chance to play, would you have? And then what position do you think you would have played?
Yeah. I mean, look, when I say I've never played. I mean, I play the odd play. It's in the schoolyard at lunchtime and play the odd school game here or there. Or so it's not like I never kicked around a footy. Certainly did. Um, but it was not particularly. I mean, I suppose if I maybe spent more time, it might have been I would have been better, but not. But judging by my sporting acumen across all sports, I doubt I would have been particularly good. But I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure I would have enjoyed it. And look, I think I would have been a pretty. I don't think I would have been anything too flashy. I think I probably would have played me in a back pocket or something, or just or on a halfback flank, rotating off the bench, doing nothing all that flashy. Sort of as a 5'10", not particularly quick or skillful or courageous player. I mean, I've been wondered, and I'm not that I have a particularly good, not that I'm particularly good sort of tank or anything like that, but I wondered maybe if I was given a role sort of as a run with player, I could have maybe had the discipline to do that. But yeah, no, it wouldn't have been anything particularly flashy. I would have been very much a role player.
At least you're honest with yourself. At least you didn't come out and go, "Yep, I'd have been a full forward and been like plugger," different things like that. So we're not going to go there. I love the honesty. Absolutely love the honesty. So you kind of gave it away a little bit earlier. You said you were a St Kilda supporter. Is it a family thing? Because I know with a lot of Victorians, sometimes your club is your family, and there's always funny stories of your parents looking at you and going, "You're going to be this supporter. If not, you're going to leave the house." So how did you become a St Kilda supporter? Was it a family thing, or was it just kind of that was the club you were around?
Yeah, no, it was a family thing. I mean, to be fair, it also is not far. St Kilda I grew up in Caulfield, which is pretty close to St Kilda, but it was more about a family thing. My dad grew up a St Kilda supporter. So it was really my dad. I mean, my mum was never been a big footy fan. I think her family wasn't particularly into footy. I think she was, if you asked her, she probably would have said she was a St Kilda supporter growing up, but not with any sort of in particular interest. My dad was, a sort of a proper footy fan, and yeah, so I think there was never any question about it. I think it was the kind of thing where he bought a St Kilda paraphernalia for me as soon as I was born, and yeah, I think he got me on the MCC waiting list as a baby as well, and so yeah, there was never any question. I never remember any time in which I thought about barracking for anyone else, or there was ever any question of it. And yeah, I mean, a lot of my friends, a lot of kids in my sort of school were Carlton supporters. Not a range. I've got friends who support most of the Victorian clubs. Who in terms of those I went to school with, there were quite a lot of Carlton. In my circles, a lot of Carlton, St Kilda, Melbourne, Essendon. And then probably a few, and then to a lesser degree, probably Richmond, Hawthorn, Collingwood, and North. And then there was the odd Geelong supporter. I can't remember there were barely any kids in my school who back to the Bulldogs because it was sort of the other side of town, and then probably Geelong did the same. Geelong had probably a couple more. And then I had a friend who's a Swans. One of my good friends is a Swan supporter. And then you don't really have don't really know many unless they've got some sort of interstate connection. Barrack for any of the non-Victorian clubs, like the odd Eagles fan who had family from Perth. But that was sort of about it. So yeah, always a St Kilda supporter. And look, I suppose at a pretty, I had a lot of ups and downs as a St Kilda supporter through my life. Obviously no premiership, but a lot of contention, and even in the sort of by the age of 6, they were in a grand final in the second year that I remember in '97. So I remember a lot of that year. Went to a lot of games that year. Lucky enough to go to the grand final, which I have very limited memories of, but I do remember a little bit of it. Probably don't appreciate the gravity. No way you appreciate the gravity at that age. I mean, it's a big deal, but you until you don't really know how big it is, until you appreciate how little, until you see the down times and you see how hard they are to make. And then, through the 2009-10 period, through probably the most exciting, the most exciting time I had as a fan was about 2004. So they started the season, they won the preseason premiership, they won the first 10 games. You're a great age, 13. So you've got a lot of, there's nothing else really important in your life, so you really can throw yourself into it. And they were a team on the rise of the young players that played a really exciting style of footy, and you think, and then the future is particularly bright. And I think that is, as a sort of a quick aside, I think that's the most exciting time to support a team, is a team on the rise, and somewhat maybe a bit unexpectedly on the rise. I think Carlton fans will be loving this year. I think that'd be a really fun year to have. Mm-hmm. They've been down for a long time, and they've got a lot of good, maybe not necessarily that young, but a lot of exciting players who are still if they've reached their peak, they're very much just reached their peak. And conversely, and similarly, Fremantle, I think it's a very exciting time to support them. Whereas I think for a team, it'd be harder at the moment to support a team like Brisbane or Geelong, who have been thereabouts for several years, and there's an expectation that you've got that for those clubs those clubs have very little to prove until they actually get to preliminary final weekend, or at least the first week of the finals. So I think the most exciting time is a club where the expectations not quite there yet. You're just on the rise, and the sky's the limit, and Collingwood I think would be great fun to support at the moment. Anyway, so that was probably St Kilda through periods there.
Awesome. So you kind of answered my next question, so I'm going to change it just a little bit. Is I always ask, especially with clubs like Carlton and St Kilda that have had kind of these lull, shall we say, when it comes to winning footy, and they're unfortunately in the bottom part of the ladder, and maybe it's just the American society a little bit, but we have a lot of people that if a team starts losing multiple years in a row, they jump ship, they waver, they do that, and I've heard this is almost sacrilege a little bit. I don't mean to relate it to religion, because sometimes it seems a little overboard, but for many people it is. What is your thought on that, for changing a club or wavering from your support of your club?
I mean, the whole nature of sport is it's all a construct, so it's all it's all sort of made up anyway. So people can do as they please really. But I think you're generally right that it is sort of the perception is that it's certainly not accepted or the widely done thing here. I think once you support, I think there's sort of occasionally your rule of thumb. You can change teams before you're 12 or something. I mean, you don't hear of many adults, or if any, changing teams unless they've got a particular reason, like their club goes out of existence, or maybe they're from a place where there hadn't been a team previously and a team comes into the competition. But look, I think the nature of fandom is that you stick with the team and you ride through the highs and lows, and it's sort of, I feel like what is fandom unless you're sports fandom is, it's sort of that I feel like it's sort of, there's a hollowness unless you actually ride and your passion can ebb and flow, and through the stages of life you have, or perhaps other teams going, or whatever else you've got going on in your life. But to me it seems it's sort of, if you're changing teams, sort of wonder what you're really in it for. And I suppose you could do it. It just seems strange. And I think the experience of someone, if you were to change teams regularly, I don't think you'd get the same level of depths of passion, depths of enjoyment at the best of times, even if the difficult times are obviously difficult.
Awesome. Yeah. And I 100% agree. Like I've even had some people go, it's like, how did you pick Sydney? And I picked Sydney, and I've said to many people, I don't think I can change. I think I picked the club that's perfect for my personality, and the fan base has been so awesome there. So we've talked a little bit about the past. Let's jump to the present right now. And you had kind of alluded to it earlier. You're a sports journalist. So you get to write about sports journalists. You write about both AFL and AFLW. So yeah, real quickly, so you said the lawyering kind of just didn't work out, which I think is fascinating. That when I chatted with Sarah Ollie, it was the same thing. Went into
Yeah.
lawyer, didn't like it, absolutely hated it, went back to uni, got her sports journalism, and absolutely loves it. So is that kind of it? Did you just you didn't enjoy the lawyering and decided I'll go into something I'm much more passionate in, and that's sports journalism?
Yeah, I sort of I didn't know Sarah well beforehand, but we do I think we sort of we were studying at Monash at a similar time actually. So we might have had some overlapping subjects. I didn't know her well, but it was funny. It's sort of we have some mutual friends through law school. Oh look, I think in hindsight, I probably thought. I think I always had a passion for sport and sport media. Probably look, I did reasonably well at high school, and I think there's a sort of perhaps from a culturally with my friends or my family. Maybe there was a feeling that doing what I currently do is not necessarily realistic, hard to get into, that and probably maybe not necessarily that stable work. So I think I was encouraged. Yeah, there was sort of a pressure. Not, when I say pressure, not a pressure in the sense that they wouldn't have, absolutely forcing me to, but it was sort of it was the done thing, accepted that you got those sort of reasonable marks, and if you weren't sure what you want to do, you did a law degree. And in my circles, so. But my heart was probably never really that in it. I struggled my way through, failed some subjects early, and my mark was never particularly impressive. And I think within a couple of years, I sort of realised it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. Look, I think it was still worthwhile to get the degree in the end. So I did finish it, but never really. But sort of from a pretty deep period, from some probably a few years in, I thought, I don't really want to practice. It's good to have as a sort of a it's good to have on the CV, and probably gives you, I think it still does have some cachet. So I wouldn't downplay it in that respect. But within a couple of years, I sort of started. And unlike Sarah, I didn't actually do a journalism degree, but I did start doing some things on the side. A side hustle. Started a website with a bunch of mates where we started a footy sort of a footy website, it was a footy commentary. It was a lighthearted footy commentary, which was actually an idea we got from a bunch of guys who were doing a similar thing in England for cricket, or I got that idea. And then there was another guy who was doing a similar thing for rugby in New Zealand, but who was doing live pub shows. So we did some shows at the Melbourne Comedy Festival. Not that they were particularly funny, but that's led to be doing a bit of sports writing and some local footy commentary, calling for a community station called Casey Radio out in Cranbourne, which is about 50 minutes from where I live. And not where Casey Fields, which is where Melbourne train. So and then have their alignments out that way. So I think one thing led to another, and I think increasingly my views were. And then I think once you probably had a little bit of not success, but a little bit of maybe traction there, that there was sort of a little bit of interest for a couple of websites in what I was doing on the local radio, and then that sort of led to one thing to another, and I started to apply for more and more things, I was writing for a website called Backpage Lead, and was very lucky that I was the Age were looking for a 12-month maternity leave contract for sort of a sports reporter and producer, and I was sort of recommended for that role by someone who I'd been working with previously at a sports website, and it was very lucky that they gave me an opportunity, and I suppose that was my huge breakthrough and major foot in the door, and I've been very lucky since then to sort of stay in the industry and had 8 amazing years at the Age. Learned so much, just owe them everything really, and it was a tough call to leave there late last year. really weighted up heavily. But to be part of this new venture at Code Sports has been very cool as well. So enjoying that so far, and just feel very lucky to have had such opportunities and to do the things I do. And there are times when you get jaded, or it's not. The job has its challenges, like any job, and frustrations, and you have your moments when you think, oh, this can be a bit painful, but when you step back and think how lucky you are, and you really do have to sort of remind yourself how lucky you are to do what you do, and that a lot of people would kill to have this sort of job and have this sort of to be taken to the places that you get taken and meet the people you meet, and sort of be able to, it's a privilege to be able to tell these stories, and so I consider myself very lucky. So that's sort of the journey of how I became a sports journalist and sort of got to where I am today.
Awesome. And you say you're working with, was it Code Sports Australia, which is can you explain that a little bit? Because I've heard of them, but I don't know what they do just a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. Fair question. It's a relatively new venture. Only launched late last year in November. So it's a subscription sports website. It's owned by News Corp. So there's a few major News Corp clearly need no introduction. So there's a few major media outlets in Australia, which media proprietors in Australia, which they were one, and I'd previously worked for one of the other main ones at Fairfax, which was bought out by Channel 9 Network, 9 Entertainment Group, which is who own The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. News, to my understanding, wanted to start their own sort of sports website. Obviously, they had their own sports offerings through their various, not obviously necessary for a US market, but News Corp have their own sports offerings through the various newspapers they own in Australia, like the Herald Sun, the Daily Telegraph, the Australian, and the Courier Mail. But I think they wanted to start a dedicated sports website, subscription sports website, which probably leans a little bit more towards longer form and analysis and feature writing, not exclusively so. And it still has a lot of the bare bones news stuff. We can actually take a lot of the News Corp network stuff, and which runs on our website as well. So it's there's probably some similarities with The Athletic to an extent. It's got some in terms of the longer form, the subscription model. There's also some similarities to KO, which is another News Corp owned product, which is the subscription sports streaming service here, or one of, but probably the leading subscription sports streaming service here. So look, I think the offering with Code is that if you or you could subscribe to both us and to some of the News Corp mastheads. But I suppose if you're not if you just want the sport and you don't necessarily want the rest of the news, the general news, the political and other stuff, you can buy so not to make this a sales pitch, but you can buy the Code. So buy Code and get what we hope is excellent coverage from our Code sort of exclusive original stuff, and then the offerings from around the rest of the News Corp sports network, plus in Australia, and then plus offerings from the Times in the UK and the Wall Street Journal, so some global sports coverage as well. So it's primarily Australian sport, and primarily the major Australian codes, AFL coverage, rugby league, cricket, which I also cover quite a bit. Netball has been covered very well, and other major sports like that. But also global sport and some of the more niche sports as well. So hopefully it's a really good offering. I mean, obviously the consumers will be the judge of that. But so that's sort of about Code Sports. and there's an app there as well. So if you're willing, feel free to download the app for those watching, listening.
I will definitely keep an eye on it. I hear KO all the time, especially a lot of my Aussie friends talk about KO all the time. And there for a while, I was almost looking into it and then realized, oh yeah, it's only in Australia. So can't get KO over here unless you want to do VPN, different things like that. So just really quickly, since it is an online forum, what's kind of your typical day? Like, are you sitting here mostly writing? Are you going out and doing interviews? Like, what's your typical day?
Yeah, it's sort of changed a little bit, say, from what I was doing at the Age, in the sense that it's not a probably you're a little bit removed from the daily news cycle, not entirely, far from it entirely, but whereas when you're running for a newspaper, it's very much you've got to put out a paper every day and keep a website ticking, so it's you're rarely looking too far ahead. Sort of trying to cover the news of the day. For me, it's quite a mixed bag. Certainly, I'm in the office. I go into our office a bit, but just a lot of our team's actually based in Sydney, but going to the office a bit to catch up with some colleagues. But otherwise, yeah, you're conducting interviews, making phone calls. Going to go to some press conferences, training sessions, catching up with contacts. I mean, journalism, I think, is ultimately, it's hard about relationships and maintaining and building relationships with with industry contacts, and the strength of I think certainly you've got to report without fear or favour, but you do need to sort of, the best reporters, even if it's not necessarily news coverage, it's informed opinion and analysis. So it's talking to people, on the inside, who, be that club people, agents, talk to some players, to the coaches, any administrators, anyone who's sort of anyone who might know something. So and then try to also get to probably a game or two a weekend as well. The coverage, my match day coverage has changed a little bit. I'm sort of more doing, I'm not really doing as much stuff on deadline, not doing sort of straight, as you would say, they're gamers, match reports, doing more featurey sort of stuff in the aftermath. So it's been great this year with COVID sort of, I'm not saying it's over, but COVID restrictions being eased clearly significantly, and we've been through massive lockdowns here in Victoria over the last couple of years, which is where access has been very limited. So been very happy to see that that the club rooms have been opened up again, and that's where access is probably its easiest and best. So trying to talk to a player in the rooms after most games and write up a story around that. That's probably been what my primary game coverage has been. So probably writing on average, probably about 5 pieces a week, something in that vicinity. That they can range in lengths. They're probably a bit longer on average than what I was writing at the Age. Probably less straight news, less of the daily news, but still, probably, if I've got a, you touched on the Montana Ham story yesterday. That's a reasonable example. If I've got a lead that isn't out there already, that they're happy for me to chase that, and I enjoy doing that. So, that's sort of what a basic week looks like. There's probably no standard day, in the sense that the days can vary, but probably in terms of the week, if you some time in the office, some time at home, working from home, some time on the road, and then some time at games, and that sort of makes up your week. And it can be a bit irregular, but that's sort of basically what it looks like.
Awesome. That's cool. And the best part is that do you have an editor kind of telling you, or is it more of just kind of you going after stories that interest you, that you really want to write about?
It's a bit of both, as it usually is. I think we're lucky. There's a fair bit of freedom at Code. Again, we're lucky in the sense that, well, I feel lucky in the sense that probably because we don't have to be quite as beholden to the daily news cycle, I have probably a bit more freedom. And part of the brief is actually to sort of write about things that others aren't necessarily writing about, or at least take different slants and angles to them. And you don't have to be quite as following the story of the day to the nth degree. So that probably allows me to have a bit more autonomy in that respect. But certainly there's we have a collaborative process, and we have regular meetings, and obviously regular, no surprise to be in regular communication with editors and producers and other writers as to what we're sort of looking at covering and ideas. So it's always a bit of both. Probably leaning a bit more towards the autonomous side in this role, perhaps compared to the previous one, but that's just sort of a nature of the different beasts. The previous one was a bit more, you had to be a bit narrower in your day-to-day thinking, or at least because it was, you had a newspaper to put out, which comes with immense challenges and is an incredible thing to be part of. They just sort of call it the daily miracle, and there is certainly an element of that.
Awesome. So you and I have a lot in similars that you do a lot of interviews. So I got to ask, with you done interviews with both The Age and with Code here, do you have a favorite interview that you've ever done?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. It's a really good question. You can do so many. It's sort of I think it's anyone where you tell a story, I think from an interview perspective. There are different pieces. Your favorite piece of journalism may be stuff that's a more sort of doesn't necessarily involve on the record interviews, and can be uncovering things that some may not necessarily want out there. But in terms of the actual interviews, I'd say there's two or three from where you tell sort of quite, where you allow interview subjects to help them tell and share quite personal, poignant stories. So a couple that spring to mind, when I was at The Age, there was one with Aaron Vandenberg, who was playing at Melbourne at the time, who finished up at the end of last year. During the 2018 final series, he told a really moving story about his the shock and sudden death of his father during that season, and how he had to deal with that, and how he had to fly back to New South Wales to sort of help run his family's business, and how he was struggling with that and having to juggle that with his footy career. So, that's very heavy stuff. So, but he was really open about it, and those sorts of stories that you have to have the subject has to be willing to tell their story. An interview in 2016 with a former Port Adelaide player, Daniel Stewart, who sort of detailed his very serious mental health issues in the wake of his footy career. A couple of other cricket stories on a similar boat. A guy named John Hastings, who played for Australia, who spoke about having to retire prematurely because he had this serious heart condition, and explaining how he went through that. And there was a former Australian cricketer named James Muirhead, who, similar to the Stewart one, spoke about the depths of his mental health issues in the immediate aftermath. So I don't know, I've just got four there. There's just four to sort of spring to mind. But it's those sort of stories. I think from an interview perspective, it's when people give you are willing to share, deep and personal stuff and trust you. I think those are the most profound interviews. I think ultimately what journalism is all about is a great piece of advice I was given from Jake Nile, which not makes sense, but it's about telling people things they don't know. And I think that's those are sort of extreme examples of that. But that's sort of what it's all about. So those would be a few of the interviews. But I've been very lucky. You have a lot of interviews, and usually there's a range, but usually even at sort of the most mundane interview, there's something out of it that you can you try to find some sort of hook, some sort of angle, but the challenge. Some are easier than others. Mm-hmm. Some subjects are oft discussed, or some interview subjects are often interviewed, and it can almost be the well has been drained a bit. So has been tapped. So those would be a few of the favorites.
Awesome. So I got to ask this. I've occasionally even seen it over here is that you get a lifelong fan that gets into journalism and they get that ultimate opportunity and they get a little starstruck. So I got to ask this. Have you ever gone into an interview or been given an assignment where you were kind of left a little starstruck? Like you still got your job done, but you were kind of surprised. You were like, oh my gosh, I get this opportunity.
I think in a weird way, it's probably it's a good question. I think I don't think there's too many times when you're like, there's probably always half an element of imposter syndrome, like what am I doing here, what am I
Mm-hmm.
when you talk to a famous sports person, why am I, what gave me the chance to do this. I don't remember particular instances where I was sort of massively starstruck. Having said that, I've done sort of press conferences with. There are times when you sort of have. I've done press conferences with. It's actually more about. I thought it's probably more places like what am I doing here? Like cover the Rio Olympics. That was amazing. You're like, this is ridiculous. Or covering overseas cricket tours, or being in the bowels of, being in the winning rooms after a grand final. So it's less about the players, probably more about the occasion. But I've attended press conferences with, Usain Bolt, Roger Federer, and Virat Kohli, the Indian cricket captain. Probably three of the most famous sports people on the planet of all time. So, particularly with Bolt, it's like, what? This is amazing. Like this guy is, this guy will. They'll be talking about this guy in 200 years' time, hopefully, and you sort of have the chance to be in his presence. So I think, it's not a starstruck in the sense you're like overcome and can't do your job, but I think you do appreciate the immense, how big these people are. I think that can't be lost on you. Yeah.
That's awesome. And that's such a cool opportunity. So I got to ask, I'm one of those that been doing this podcast. I've sat there and I've made a list of dream interviews, the interview that I really, really want. I'm not sure I'll ever get, but I want to. So I'm going to give you that opportunity. You get it. Who is your dream interview? Who's the one person you really want to sit down and either tell a story or just to communicate with?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah. Gee, that's a tough question.
Making you think on this one.
Yeah. I think. I think it's funny. I think a lot of the interesting interviews would be I think the people that would be hardest to get and would not necessarily make the most interesting interviews. I mean, there is sort of that's the reason that they're media averse. I think a lot of times that they wouldn't be. You could talk about someone like a Gary Ablett Senior or a Dustin Martin or Buddy Franklin that don't do much media.
But Adam Goods too is another.
Yeah, Adam Goods would be. Yeah, look, Goods would be a good one. Goods is probably. I hadn't thought of Goods, but I think Goods would be because I think he actually would. If you knew Goods was going to offer you something, I say offer in the sense of was going to be forthcoming with his answers. I think he'd be great. In a weird way, it's not someone that's particularly inaccessible, but I think maybe just because I've been growing up as a St Kilda supporter, I'd be interested to sit down with Ross Lyon because I find him just a fascinating guy and very good media performer and thoughtful, and to talk through. I feel like if you had a couple of hours with him, you could really go into some interesting places. But again, it would need him to be forthcoming He'd be a great sort of deep dive interview. I know that's not necessarily a particularly exciting name. There'd be some in cricket as well. I think right now, the former Australian cricket coach Justin Langer. I'm not sure he'd want. I don't think he'd want to sit down with me, to be honest. But with some of my coverage of him, but I think he'd be very interesting to talk to if he was forthcoming. Those are probably the ones I can think of. But I'm sure I'll think of another one after this interview.
It's always the ones that you think about. Like Goodsey is one of those that I would absolutely love to be able to sit down and have a chat with. And I know it's pie in the sky. I know it, but being a little American podcast here, but you can have your dreams. You can have your dreams. I didn't think I'd get Jude Bolton, and I had the luxury of talking with him, and he was absolutely brilliant, absolutely fun chat. So I'm going to have you take off your journal hat for just a little bit. And I want you to put your fan hat. I want to put your St Kilda hat on a little bit. Thoughts on St Kilda's season so far? We are 14 rounds in. I know this last round was not exactly, shall we say, memorable, unfortunately, for Spud's game, unfortunately. But just what are your thoughts on St Kilda right now? And are you at all concerned that they may fall out of the finals, or do you think they'll kind of step up and be able to keep themselves not only in the finals but be in contention?
I think overall, I think if you said at the start of the year that they'd be 8-5, particularly after losing to Collingwood in round one, albeit Collingwood have sort of exceeded expectations from that point themselves. I think you would have said, that's been it's a pretty good result for St Kilda, all things considered. But right now, on the back of the very poor performance against Essendon and consecutive losses and being 8-5 in a very 8-5 would sometimes have you in the top four, but this year, because of the sort of the shake out of the ladder and the way it's shaping, and particularly the fact that you've got two teams who are far and away so poor that they're the poorest in the league and aren't winning games at all. Or they're both 1-1 each in West Coast and North Melbourne. You're getting the distribution of wins is being, is coming around that middle of the ladder, the top to middle of the ladder. So you're having, I think teams will miss the 8 with 12 and 30. I think a team will miss the 8 with someone will miss the 8 with 12 wins. I think possibly multiple teams, maybe even 13, which would be unusual. So now St Kilda are up against it now at 8-5 with challenges outside the 8. Collingwood, Port Adelaide, Gold Coast, and the Bulldogs, all with their own claims. Saints have a tough draw. They get Jack Steele back this week, which is a big in. I think, look, the Essendon game on the basis, so from what we've seen this season, is a massive missed opportunity, but it was an aberration. That was far and away their worst showing. They haven't played such low intensity really at any game this year. It was low pressure, very low contested possession and tackle count, and they were just, they were. The effort was poor. It was not an execution thing. It was the execution wasn't good either. But they were poor effort wise. So I think I think the Saints are up against it. They've got a tough run home. Look, if you had to, right now, I'd say they probably won't make it because I think it was a really, really big missed opportunity. And at 8-5, even looking through a prism where given how they've just played, it's hard to have much faith in them. But I certainly wouldn't be shocked if they did make it. I think it's going to be touch and go now. They'll be in the mix. Another huge game against your club this week for both teams. And then they play Carlton the following week. So, a lot of sort of 8-point games coming up. Clearly, they're still, destiny's still very much in their own hands. So, and they've given themselves a solid platform, and then they're not far off being in top 4 contention again. But they've got to make sure that was an aberration. Otherwise, they will very quickly slip from the top 8, and they'll be lucky to finish, any higher than 12th if they play like that.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating over these next couple of weeks how it goes, because you really do have the two other teams that a lot of people are discussing it being those wavering teams. Sydney, like St Kilda, did not play well against Port Adelaide. I think Port Adelaide played a little bit better than people were expecting. I think they're one of those sleeping giants teams that if they can stay healthy, they're scary. You
Mm.
don't want to play them as this end of the year goes. Same thing with Gold Coast and Collingwood. Like there's 3 teams outside of the 8 right now that if I'm any team in the 8, I'm terrified of those teams because they're winning games. They're winning games impressively. They look good doing it. So it's kind of very interesting to be a supporter of a club that's just barely in the 8 because you're like you kind of have to win every game as much as possible and then just
Mm.
hope you get a little bit of help because that's really the way it's going to come down to it. So we'll go from St Kilda to overall this year's men's season. I'm going to say it. I have been fascinated by this year. Yes, I agree with you. North Melbourne, West Coast have been putrid, and that's maybe even being nice to them. But I'm thoroughly enjoying this. Melbourne's kind of come back to the crowd. Brisbane's still showing some vulnerabilities, in my personal opinion. Fremantle, the people out west are losing their minds that Fremantle is in the flying contendership discussion. So, I mean, how awesome is this season? Taking away from your St Kilda supporter, how awesome is this season? Because you've got 12 teams still in the hunt over these next 8 weeks. This is going to be fascinating footy to watch.
Yeah, certainly. Um, you know, can't put it much better than the way that you have. It's and it's good to have a bit of you've got a good mix of teams as well. It's sort of you got the sort of the reigning premiers who are flagging a bit now and have obviously had off-field dramas. You've got a couple of clubs in Brisbane and Geelong are who sort of have huge points to prove but sort of probably won't be able to do that until later in the season. Just have to hang on and then make sure they're playing their best footy at that stage. You've got interesting rising challenges like Fremantle, probably the leading one there, but also Carlton. You've got Port Adelaide and the Western Bulldogs, both started the season quite poorly, but who are known, whose best is very capable and trying to get in. You've got Gold Coast, who've never made the finals, never gets the backdrop of an out of contract coach, and then that whole narrative. You got Richmond as sort of the aging champions who are whether they had one last genuine roll of dice left in them, and then teams like Sydney's and Kilda. So it's great, and I mean it's the equalised competition, isn't it? It's the AFL have done made a concerted effort. It's a bit like I know they've modelled themselves on the NFL's sort of any given Sunday motto or mantra, and you have to say it's worked to this point.
Yeah, 100% agree. So we're going to jump from the men's competition to the women's competition just a little bit because one of the reasons that we got in touch with each other was the Montana Ham thing. So let's rewind just a little bit. Kind of what were your thoughts on this last season, AFLW season 6? Adelaide Crows get the chocolates. And it was kind of a season where the top 6 were pretty obvious. You had a couple of teams who were right there towards the end of the Western Bulldogs and Gold Coast, but in all, coming into this season with knowing that we have 4 new expansion teams coming into this season, kind of what were your thoughts on last year? And did it kind of go to your expectations at all?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Look, last season was it was the same 6 clubs made the finals as did the previous season, and there was a fair overlap even between them from the clubs that was still going. I think, with the exception of Carlton, who was still going when the 2020 season was postponed. So AFLW form has been pretty stable. There's not, when you look at compared, I'd have to look at the numbers, but anecdotally, I would have thought the upset level is considerably lower than it is in the men's competition, which makes for a pretty predictable, season. That there are pretty clear gulfs. It's still the AFLW is still going through growing pains. It hasn't reached a point where it's reached its sort of natural cycle because of a semi-professional nature and the state-based draft, which sort of, relevant to the Montana Ham story clearly, and then the fact that you've got clubs that are, and then the fact that you've got expansion, now coming up to the 3rd expansion round, or we've just gone through the 3rd expansion round. So in the space of 5 years, so that's created its own that creates its own market forces, and the general rule has been, I suppose, that the strong clubs have tended to remain strong. The expansion clubs have increasingly picked off from the middle bracket as well, and they've not, the strongest clubs have not been affected to the extent that probably the AFL would have hoped. So I think the season, largely went as planned, or as expected. The strong clubs remain strong. Adelaide have been the standouts across 6 seasons, but Brisbane and Melbourne as well have been very consistent. Fremantle in the last 4 seasons, and Collingwood in the last 3, and North Melbourne have been thereabouts since their entrance as well. So, sadly, it's hard to think that too much of that will change. I think, not sadly, not sadly if you're one of these clubs, but I think maybe from an equalisation and interest perspective, probably suboptimal. I think Adelaide barely, they lost Aaron Phillips, but they kept most of their senior talent. Melbourne, really didn't lose anyone of major note. Brisbane, likewise. Fremantle and North were hit, obviously Fremantle hit a bit more, Collingwood a little bit. But I think the top 3, the best 3 clubs in it, I'd say, are still Adelaide, Brisbane, and Melbourne, and they're all largely unaffected. So they're gonna still take some beating, and I think it's the middle. And I can't see enough of the middle range clubs, because probably the one club I thought was sort of looking reasonably promising and had a good young core on the rise with the Western Bulldogs, but then they've been hit heavier than pretty much anyone. So maybe Gold Coast. So it's I think I'm a bit apprehensive as to what as to just how one-sided some games could be this season in the AFLW.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see. I completely agree on that. So we jump from there to, okay, the expansion is done. We've had, again, the movement, as you kind of said. Carlton, the Western Bulldogs, and I think Gold Coast were some of the teams that were hit the hardest when it came to Carlton. Absolutely got obliterated, unfortunately, and you kind of feel sorry for them a little bit, losing your best and fairest, losing some really strong players. So on some of the expansion moves, were there any that caught you off guard that you were like, "Ooh, wasn't expecting this player to move here"?
Yeah, probably the 2 that caught me off guard, and maybe I think they probably catch you off guard when maybe you caught more off guard when you don't when you don't get any wind of the story and someone else gets the story. Because a lot of them had been forecast a while out. But I was Jenna Houghton going to Port Adelaide. That surprised me. Yeah, that was an interesting. There's sort of no natural connection there. She's not South Australian. It wasn't sort of. There wasn't didn't seem to be a natural link there, but I think they, thought of the farm, but fair enough too. Very good player. And I was a bit surprised when Brooke Lachlan popped up at Sydney, but by the same token, I think the Swans were, they had money money to spend as well, and having missed out on several of their primary targets, they're probably working their way down through a list, and then Brooks, been a very good player, particularly at the best, and still have, hopefully, is a good leader and could offer something. So they were probably the 2 that caught me a touch off guard. Yeah.
I was one of those. I think the Bonnie Too Good one kind of surprised me a tiny bit, maybe just more of because with Isabel Huntington deciding to go up to GWS, I thought this was Bonnie Too Good's chance to be kind of the top dog. And I'm not trying to do the pun there. She would be the top dog in the kennel. She would be that lead. She would be that number 1 forward there. So her deciding to move over to Essendon did kind of surprise me a little bit. And again, I don't know what their work things is. And for many of these ladies, they're actually making their decision not because of football, but because of work. So that's, I think, the other thing that I also kind of have to tune myself out of sometimes. It's not just they're moving because the footy is the reason they're moving. They're moving because maybe this is closer to their job. Maybe it's closer to where they live currently when it comes to training, because the training is such an interesting environment. So I had to kind of rewind myself just the tiniest bit on that, about going, okay, not every single one of these moves is going to be a footy based move. It could be a move because of their work. So All right. So, and I'll go with this. Let you put your St. Kilda hat back on again. Thoughts on St. Kilda's losses from the expansion, and were you a little sad to see Tilly Lucas Rod find her way down to Hawthorn?
Yeah, that was a shame. She had an excellent season and has been she came as a listed free agent from Carlton and had been sort of on the fringe player there. Turned herself into a very good player at St Kilda, and you're probably the best player in 2022, first half of the first season. So yeah, she's a clear loss, and I think that probably goes back again to the point where Hawthorn, having gone hard, say after Emily Bates, and not being able to land the best players from the top clubs, ended up picking off someone from a middle to lower club like St Kilda. So the Saints, they get Aaron McKinnon from the Giants, so they probably end up around or neutralised. But again, is that they can't be, especially with Georgia Patricios' future still up in the air. Tiana Smith set to miss another season because of being brought forward in her knee injury. I just can't see St Kilda taking any significant steps forward with their current, having lost their best active midfielder at the moment. So yeah, that was disappointing to see from a St Kilda perspective, and probably symptomatic of or emblematic of the general tendency of the clubs to, or the fact that it was not the top clubs that were most heavily affected.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree, and that one did kind of that one hurts. That one really hurts. So I know this is the most contentious thing this entire off season, and I want to get your thoughts on it. The thoughts on the August start day, because I've been one of those that I've sat on every single spot on this particular argument, and I understand so many arguments from the players, from the fans, from the coaches, from the administrations, all that. So really quickly, your thoughts on this. Do you think, can you see the positives out of this? The fact that you're getting them out of the hot weather, you're getting them into cooler temperatures, you're getting hopefully on a little bit better grounds, especially, or is this one of those, you look at it as these girls are going to basically go through 2 seasons in 1 year?
Oh, I think you've got to look at. I think you've got to remove the 2022 from the example. I mean, there's always going to be, if you're moving season start dates, there's going to be at some point there's going to be some
Overlap.
overlap, or there's going to be some lumps there. It's going to be a bit lumpy. You're going to have either you have a huge gap or you have a small gap or a tiny gap. And I think the women have been pushing for longer seasons, so I don't think they can claim that they want to be playing everyone. So they're going to end up playing 20 home and away games, and it's not as though they're playing 50 games a year. They wanted more games. I don't think that's huge. I don't think that can be used as a big issue. This year, especially they had a season that was cut off early a couple of years ago. I think that argument doesn't hold much weight with me. But look, I think December, January had some merit. Ultimately, it comes down to clear air. The summer, the heat, the heat is not, moving away from the oppressive heat is good from a player welfare perspective. But I think it's not the reason they've done it. I think the reason they've done it is to try to, still to try to get people interested in going to games and watching on TV, and they feel as though August and September is a period where there's still a lot of interest in footy. In theory, footy is that most people are most engaged in it because it's the men's finals time, but there's actually because of the nature of the finals, there's not that much footy being played. And so that you can sort of tap into that window. It's a nicer time of year. And then October and November are probably relatively barren months on the Australian sporting calendar again. So you're not competing with the peak of cricket or tennis. So I like the move. I think it's got weight. I think you've got to try things. It's probably still yet to figure out exactly where it fits into the landscape. But I like it. I like it.
I like the move. I almost wish they would have kind of staggered it a little bit to kind of let the ladies get kind of adjusted to it. Like that was my only thing. Like I think August's perfect because again, it's at a more as they kind of say, free air. Again, I don't think it's ever going to get fully free air,
No.
just the way kind of the sporting calendar is. There's no way that it's ever going to be completely full air, free air, but I think this is probably the best possible situation there. So I'm excited for this season. Again, really quickly, it's one of the reasons that we're having this chat. I mean, when did you find out about Montana Ham finding a way to nominate for New South Wales? And is this a shock? Because I mean, last year Charlie Rowbottom did it. She nominated for Queensland, and now it's going to Gold Coast. So is this kind of the move now for some of the interstate clubs, is to try to find ways to get some of the top Victorian talent to nominate for their state, as long as this stays a state-based draft in the AFLW?
Uh, I found out about it yesterday. Made a couple of calls and firmed it up very quickly. Which is good because I'm sure it would have got out elsewhere pretty quickly as others were onto it. Look, it's become a bit of a, it's clear there's precedent with Rowbottom. It's become a bit of a move. You've got an artificial landscape at the moment where it's very different landscape to the men's salary cap, clearly semi-professional athletes. I think this is going to be a short-term phenomenon, because in the long run, hopefully sooner rather than later, it's fully professional. You have a national draft like the men, like the boys, and players go anywhere and everywhere, and that is a great. It serves as an equalising force. So, at the moment, clubs are trying to make best of what they can in an artificial, and it's all artificial, but in this landscape. Hopefully it doesn't last too long. Donnie, I've got to head off, to be honest. I've got to duck off to a meeting, if you don't mind.
Absolutely no problem. So I think we will shut that off there. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk again. No problem. Daniel, I appreciate the chat, sir. You have yourself a wonderful day. Okay.
You too, Johnny. You take care. I appreciate it. Thanks for the chance. Thank you.
No problem. Cheers. And that's the end of our episode, ladies and gentlemen.